I would like to invite our first speaker, Katie Pierce, who is going to present to us on the CARE data principles, Indigenous data, data related to Indigenous peoples and interest primer. And Katie, I think I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michaela. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, here we go. So thank you everyone today. So our data primer, the CARE principles for ethical data stewardship, came about from an interest with our group around ethical data practices and Indigenous data. So we wanted to provide a resource on CARE principles as it would pertain specifically to data curation. So if you're unfamiliar with CARE, these principles have long been a part of traditional Indigenous knowledge practices, but it was formalized at a workshop with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance back in 2018. So CARE stands for collective benefit, which is about maximizing benefits to the community and minimizing harms. Then authority to control, which prioritizes community control and access to data. Then we have responsibility, which is about building reciprocal relationships. If you're gathering data from a community, what's your responsibility to them and their interests? Finally, we have ethics, which is going to be prioritizing the rights and well-beings of that community and using their ethical frameworks when considering harm or benefits. So the bulk of our primer is really about the context around CARE and the philosophy around it. So we go into touching on the historical context of it, what it means to build relationships with Indigenous communities, the philosophies behind CARE, such as what is tribal sovereignty, what are Indigenous rights, what's Indigenous data governance, and then within the US, tribal governments are actually seen as sovereign entities. So there's considerations with that within the US. And so researchers should really need to be familiar with the historical context that has led to the mistrust of scientific community and understand how Indigenous data governance and data sovereignty can really empower these communities to use their own data for the betterment of those communities. So throughout this guide, we've highlighted examples of how CARE principles have been incorporated in different projects, such as the Native Health Database, Oklahoma State's College of Osteopathic Medicine at Cherokee Nation, and content management systems like Mukutu, which is built specifically for Indigenous communities and cultural knowledges. And so we wanted to highlight kind of some of those projects and show the ways that they've incorporated the CARE principles into the work that they're doing. And then, so then our group, our self-selected group, we recognized that we had a need to get more representation from people with Indigenous backgrounds and that identified as Indigenous. So we spent a lot of time researching some of the context around CARE and its historical background. And while we were doing that, we were looking for potential collaborators. So we were very lucky to be able to partner with a couple people from the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, including Dr. Stephanie Russo-Carroll, who is one of the original authors of the CARE principles in that sort of primary guiding literature. So we also had someone from the Native Health Database at University of New Mexico, and these collaborators offered invaluable insight and feedback to the process. So we're really grateful for them lending their time and expertise to us. And we also partnered with the Network of National Library of Medicine in Region 3, so that way we could pay collaborators for their time and for their contributions to this guide. So really what our hope is with this primer is that the starting point for thinking about ethical data and ethical data practices, and what this means for librarians, for curators, for researchers, and what they can do to uphold and amplify Indigenous rights and Indigenous data governance, particularly when it comes to data curation, but just kind of what that looks like holistically too. And then this last slide is just our contact information, and the QR code links to our guide. So you're more than welcome to follow that to the link to our guide. But that's just a little bit about the CARE primer that we've been working on, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the QA time. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. we are now going to queue up our next speaker, Andrew Johnson, who will present on the Interdisciplinary and Highly Collaborative Research Data Primer, which is one of my favorites because they came up with a very cool acronym that I hope will be highlighted in the presentation. Andrew?
I lost my unmute controls. So can everybody see the slides here?
Yes, we can. Oh, wait, now we see the Google slide. Yep, you're good.
All right. No, I did it again. Sorry. How about there? I'm not going to touch anything else.
You're good. We still see the slide.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, so as Michaela said, I'm representing the IHCR Data Primer Group, or Interdisciplinary and Highly Collaborative Research. And there's a number of us on the team that I'll show the list later, but also wanted to note that kind of the inspiration and some of the content for this primer came out of an IMLS grant project that involved my institution, which is the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as Virginia Tech. And I saw John Petters was on here. He was kind of the lead at Virginia Tech. And then the lead institution was Indiana University, and Ina Cooper was the overall project lead on that grant. And I saw Ina on the call as well too. So great to have everybody here. Yeah, so we just to kind of start with a quick definition of what we consider IHCR data to be, and all of the content on these slides was kind of just pulled out of the primer, and it's just sort of organized here to keep myself on track. So you can kind of find everything in the primer itself as well. But we started with the overall kind of high-level definition of IHCR data, which is data from research that combines resources and expertise across domains, communities, and institutions. So we're talking about lots of different domains, lots of different institutions, different communities. This often involves lots of different types of data as well, including different types of data formats. We also provided in the primer a couple of examples, notable examples to give people an idea of what these projects look like, including the International Polar Years project and the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, the collaborative projects that come out of that center. And you can see that both of these examples have a wide range of different types of data and institutions involved in their projects. So those are some kind of high-level examples. There's a lot more challenges that we've kind of detailed in the primer itself, but some of the high-level challenges with IHCR data that we noted in our grant project that kind of informed the development of this primer were things like there's a lot more issues of keeping track of data because it could be at many different institutions, many different systems being used. We see more types of analyses and software packages in these projects, which raises issues of reproducibility, of course. A lot of these projects, because they don't have kind of domain solutions and things like that, develop their own solutions for data management, data curation, data analysis, which can then kind of be sort of temporary and go away after the project ends. There can be a lack of a designated, there's no domain repository because this is a sort of a new interdisciplinary domain, or you might see, several different types of data that will go to multiple repositories for a single project. So there, that creates some kind of organizational issues there as well. And then lots of documentation challenges for these projects as they get complex in terms of the disciplines involved in the institutions, the number of people. There may not be a metadata standard that can be used, or there may be multiple standards. And then we really see, I think all of these things actually can be issues for single domain projects as well. But they're all kind of exacerbated by the nature of IHCR data. And really what it leads to is that curation at the end is often too late. So there's a need to move curation upstream, which was sort of the impetus for developing that other checklist that Michaela alluded to. So on that note, some of the highlights that I think I wanted to call out with this primer are we do provide like a mix of conceptual and practical guidance. So we provide some recommended actions and things on the practical side, but we also have some scenarios that we've pulled out of our IMLS grant research to illustrate some of the challenges I mentioned, as well as additional challenges. So these are kind of generalized examples of what IHCR projects might face. And then, as I've just mentioned, we also we provided these recommended actions for the kind of standard DCN curated checklist, which we see sort of as happening at the time when data is deposited to a repository for curation. But we also developed a separate acronym called ACTIVE. And this was a checklist that was aimed more at coming up with a framework for moving curation to the beginning of the project or even before a project starts, all the way through kind of a project lifecycle. And we felt like this was really necessary for addressing some of the particular challenges that come up with IHCR data. But we think that it also could be useful to adapt for other data. And if anybody wanted to have conversations about that, we would very much welcome this. So just a very quick overview of what that active curation checklist looks like. As you can see, I think we started with the acronym because that's sort of the key to success in the data and academic space. You got to have a good acronym like FAIR and CARE and everything like that. So we started with active, and we kind of came up with a framework for how we would see curation moving through this whole project lifecycle approach, starting again, really kind of before the project with advocacy, which maybe isn't an obvious part of curation, but we think is very important for getting in on the ground floor with these projects, and then moving into more kind of collaboration, testing, implementation, verify, and engage. So it's a very much more kind of alive and iterative process than you might think of with traditional data curation. And within the primer itself, we have kind of more specific actions for all of these letters as well. So I just wanted to highlight the contributors in terms of the authors to the primer itself, our fantastic DCN mentors and peer reviewers, and then the acknowledgement of the funding source for the IMLS grant. And then lastly, just ending with our overall project website, and it provides more information about that grant and all the resources that came out of it. And we would love to hear any feedback or engagement on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm assuming that you will put that final link in the chat for us. And we are going to keep on moving along and get to our third presenter of the kind of session today on Simple Darwin Core for Non-Biologists Primer. This was created by Leslie Del Cerrone and Megan O'Donnell. Leslie, Megan, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Michaela. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen here. And yes, just an introduction. My colleague Megan O'Donnell will be contributing in just a little bit to the presentation. I'm based at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Megan is based at Iowa State University. And of course, now my system is being difficult. Okay. Hopefully you are seeing the correct slide. Yes. So we're just going to provide you with sort of an overview of why we felt the need to put this primer together and what the main parts of it that might be of use to you are. So Darwin Core itself originated within the community of biodiversity researchers, and so as a result, may have some things that we might consider missing. And as we will note later, there is certainly in some cases a lack of detail and description. It was a working group of scientists, the Taxonomic Databases Working Group, that finally got to a place where the standard was approved in 2009. And since then, it's really developed in several different directions. There's an XML implementation. There's been an incorporation into the resource description framework. There are several controlled vocabularies for Darwin Core. But Megan and I knew kind of from the beginning that we were only going to address what is known as simple Darwin Core, which is applied to a single flat file. And trust me, simple is not so simple as we state in the primer. The illustration there is part of a Darwin Core record, just to give you a sense of the application of the standard. So we actually chose the primer topic so long ago, Megan, maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that we were both just genuinely interested in it, both because we both have a biological sciences background, but also we found ourselves working with biodiversity data collections and natural history collections. And we wanted to find a way to provide better access and description of these data, which, as you might imagine, are becoming very key as we deal with some of the climate crisis, climate change issues that we are seeing around the world. So our question was, we had the advantage because we had a biological sciences background in looking at the standard, but what about curators that don't have that background? And it is highly likely that curators are going to encounter going forward more tabular and image data to which simple Darwin core will be applicable. So we provide information in the primer on data formats and the data types you may encounter. We provide some description of simple Darwin core. For example, there are actually no mandatory fields. There are shoulds and nots, but no mandatory. As usual, questions to ask yourself as the curator and questions to ask the researcher you're working with. And we provide a fairly detailed breakdown of the standard and its core elements, which are comprised of 8 classes and 1 category. So this is more than 200 potential fields, and all these fields are optional, and many, unfortunately, are not well described. So it can be a little bit hard to know where to begin and what can be excluded and how they all fit together. And so in order to provide some guidance on that front, I give full credit to my co-author, Megan, for the idea of the cheat sheet. And so Megan, would you like to take it from here? And I will advance the slides as you go along.
Sure, thanks, Leslie. So yeah, as Leslie mentioned, we both worked with biodiversity data, and our project here first kind of alerted me that Darwin Core was not a very friendly data standard, though being very important when a metadata librarian came and asked me for help deciphering what the fields were and how they should be used. And it turned into like a big discussion because what the word was in biology was not what the word was outside of biology. And so they couldn't end up using some of the fields they had hoped to use. So when we were deep in this, I decided I needed to actually map out my ideas and see if I understood Darwin Core correctly. And so I made a spreadsheet because data librarian, I like spreadsheets. And so we ended up with 3 worksheets in the spreadsheet file. The first is just all the fields with some definitions, descriptions, and some shortcuts for vital information on if you plan to use the field. And then the second one kind of is the data dictionary for the first worksheet, and the third one is a cheat sheet for the core classes of Darwin Core. So Leslie, let's go to the next slide. So this is a screen cap from the lovely cheat sheet. We have the class or category on the left, and I don't know why one of them is a category and the rest of them are classes. I could not find a reason for why there's different vocabulary. And then the field name, the official definition, details that relate to that definition. And then sometimes there's a requirement about what kind of information should be in that field. So for example, should it have some sort of standard applied to what goes in there? I'll say standard for the one that says scientific name ID. That's actually supposed to be a uniform resource locator or some other ID number and not a like text field for plain text. And then some very basic recommendations on like if you should use it or maybe how often you'll see it, what kind of applications you'll see it in, and then some basic notes to try and explain in more less biology jargon what it is and how it might be used. And there are over 200 fields, but we did not put all of them in the cheat sheet. There was one section that is for fossils that was all about geology that neither of us had the literacies to try and work on. So that's a known area that we could work on. Leslie, do you want to wrap up?
I guess I can. So even though we think this will be useful to you, we have to acknowledge that there's limitations of both the primer and the cheat sheet. And a big one is that Darwin Core continues to evolve. And in fact, it evolved on us while we were in the middle of the first version of this primer. So it was COVID pandemic plus the taxonomy group changing things on us that complicated things a bit. This cheat sheet is really not authoritative. We have not, officially run it by the Darwin Core community. As Megan mentioned, we don't have the expertise to cover all the fields. So you'll see there's no information with regards to geological information or fields. And, when it comes to implementation, we can't really assess like how our primer guidelines and cheat sheet conform with implementation by different research groups and databases. But there is a link in the primer to the Darwin Core Quick Reference Guide, which should be checked for the most current and authoritative information. So we hope that this has been of some use. We'll be happy to take questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie and Megan, and I hope they won't mind my saying, but you all have been just troopers in finishing that primer. I know that with like Leslie and Megan and I were at the same workshop in 2019, I believe, like right before the pandemic hit. And so I know that many of us struggled to like pick up projects that had fallen off, and you two did a phenomenal job of that. Hope you're not too embarrassed by my saying that. Okay, our final presentation of the day is on, oh, sorry, I can hear my dog, is on our Python primer. And KP, I'm gonna turn it to you while my dog barks.
All right, hello. My name is KP May. I am the Data and Social Sciences Librarian at Tulane University in the beautiful New Orleans. And I will be talking to you about the work that myself and my buddies did on the Python primer. So let me get this screen shared. How do you share these things? Okay, wait. I'm turning this to my mom. I don't know what to do with technology these days. Let's see. Ah, there we go. All right. So Python primer, here is my team and our mentor. I'm really grateful for this team because they kind of brought me in last minute. And so this is one of my ways of paying it forward, doing this presentation for them. So hello team, wherever you're viewing this video from. So the purpose of our primer was to provide data curators and researchers, that's the key element here, with best practices for ensuring that Python files in related formats are preservable and reusable. There we go. So when we were building this primer, we really based a lot of our content on what was provided with the R primer, which is currently available. So even though that format is the same, I did want to spend this time to surface some things that I feel are going to be important for people who are visiting this primer with limited experience with the format, and also surfacing resources from the primer that I think would be very important to share with the researcher. So I'm actually going to leave the presentation and go straight into the primer. All right. So can y'all see the screen with the, yeah, you can see it, you can see it. All right, so here, as I said before, you can see our outline for what we included in the primer, but I do want to call your attention very specifically to information about README files. So something that I see in a lot of the work that I do, helping people curate Python files or add descriptive information to Python files, is that their README is often incomplete. And so incomplete can obviously mean various things depending on the context of what is included in the code. But what we did provide was this tier system for what we would consider minimum requirements for README. Then there's runnable submission requirements and then comprehensive metadata. And so when you're working with a researcher, or if you're a researcher yourself, coming to this guide to really think through the README structure as you move through the coding process. And so I think someone mentioned this earlier, understanding that the curation starts at the very beginning. So these are important things to think about at the beginning. Another thing from the primer that I thought would be important to surface in this environment is information we provided on dependencies. So there, a lot of times when there is research code and it is not able to run, it is the environment that the code was ran on previously was not the environment that the code is run on in the curation setting. So making sure you express to researchers ahead of time to document dependencies in Python using something like pip or conda. These are tools that are easy to learn, especially if you watch videos on YouTube. Well, let me take that back. They're easy to find YouTube videos about, let's say that. So if you have not heard of PIP or have not heard of Conda, there are tons of resources out that are open for people to consult, and also resources for you to send the researcher as well. Yes, we love a good YouTube video. Exactly. Also, LinkedIn Learning. If anyone here has access to LinkedIn Learning, that's also a good tool for this sort of thing. So let me go back. Hope I'm not moving too fast. So we talked about README requirements that being important, dependencies being important. And then the last part of our primer, the section is called ways in which fields may use this format, but there's a lot of other good stuff under there. So I'm going to go down to that section. So we have this example of a data set citation, which is also that I think researchers and curators are thinking about more now that people are being pushed and sometimes required to publish research data. So there is some kind of guidance here about data set citations for you. We have information here about books and documentation, tutorials. The one that I thought was important was, I'm just going to do a Control F, the PEP 8 standards. So if you all have never heard of PEP 8, PEP 8 is more or less like a style guide. Let me go ahead and do this. So PEP 8, like I said, is more or less like a style guide or like best practices for styling text in Python. And so what I've noticed a lot of times with my work at Tulane is we'll have researchers who were taught how to code in a very sporadic way, or they were taught to code for one particular purpose. And so some of these styling details they may not be aware of. So I think this is another good resource to give researchers when they're starting this process. So as promised, I will not read the whole primer to you. You all are smart. But I do want to make sure that you understand that researchers are curators too. This is their research, right? They should have they should feel like they have agency and control over the work that they do. So making sure you express that to them and let them understand that this guide is not just for me as a curator, it's also for you as a researcher, right? And then the last thing is bookmark the primer. I know that as a librarian or as a curator, as a data person, you all are probably like me. You keep 20 tabs up at one time. Just bookmark this baby and come back to it later. And then I think that's it. So thank you for having me.
JP, that was excellent. Thank you so much. And you're already getting a lot of appreciation in the chat for that.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Well, at this point, we are going to give our presenters a round of applause. It can be virtual. And I'm going to stop the recording so we can have our Q&A.